Ryu has been Street Fighter's poster boy from the very beginning, and while not always the main protagonist, he's still a linchpin for and the most important character to the franchise. Through the entire Street Fighter story, Ryu's unique inner power and potential constantly grabs the attention of other characters, and it's this same inner power that both drives him forward and sets him back as he attempts to balance it. Street Fighter VI will be the latest chronological entry on the timeline, and so we thought we'd go back over Ryu's history up until this point to get some ideas of where Capcom might take this iconic character next. A good guy clearly meant to be something of a blank slate for players to project their own selves onto, Ryu's beginnings are intentionally vague. Orphaned at a young age with no recollection of his biological parents, Ryu's story really begins when he was adopted by a martial arts master named Goken. Goken basically raises Ryu and teaches him to be a stoic martial artist in the ways of Ansatsuken, instructing him on how to perform awesome attacks like the iconic Hadouken and Shoryuken, also known as the Dragon Punch. Much of his training and upbringing is influenced by the presence of yet another student under Goken's teaching, Ken Masters. Now, by his early 20s, Ryu is ready to start off on his journey, and so he and the Super Smash Bros. Home Run Sandbag head out to see what the world has to teach them, and soon thereafter stumble upon the first World Warrior Tournament. This brings us to the events of Street Fighter 1. Ryu enters the tournament and cleans house, making it all the way to the final boss, Sagat, the one-eyed Emperor of Muay Thai who doesn't have a giant scar on his chest. They fight. Sagat actually gains the upper hand and momentarily knocks Ryu out. This is when we get our first sighting of Ryu's inner struggle with the widely evil Satsui no Hado energy, which translates to Surge of Murderous Intent. The fight to balance increasing power without giving in to the killing intent that very power makes increasingly possible characterizes Ryu's main and most interesting struggle throughout almost all of his story. Ryu taps into the Satsui no Hado here and performs the very first wake-up DP of all time, nailing the one-eyed Emperor of Muay Thai, who now has a giant scar on his chest. Salty for having lost his status as the top fighter around and having gained a massive scar, but mostly for being the first person to ever experience getting hit with a scrubby wake-up DP, Sagat devotes himself to vengeance against Ryu. Oh, and this also means Ryu wins the very first World Warrior Tournament. So Ryu goes home to put his tournament win certificate on the fridge and also ask what the heck that evil superpower he tapped into was. When he gets there, he finds Goken dead, killed by his brother Akuma with a raging demon, a technique so powerful it kills people until Capcom needs them to come back for Street Fighter IV. Somewhat perturbed by the murder of his master and father figure, Ryu sets out to find Akuma, which leads us into the events of Street Fighter Alpha. Alpha is not based around a tournament and is kind of a hodgepodge of various characters meeting up, talking, and fighting. Ryu encounters Akuma on an island called Gogento, who actually tells him a bit about the Satsui no Hado since it's the energy that he himself uses and is trying to perfect. He explains that it ultimately consumes those who use it, and practitioners of it essentially exchange their humanity for murderous power. They fight, but Akuma takes a particular interest in Ryu's potential, and so he lets him win, destroys the island, and splits, hoping to see Ryu's progress with the Satsui no Hado at a later time. And then during the events of Alpha, Ryu is visited by Ken, who can see his buddy is very troubled from his recent findings and offers him a friendly fight to help clear his mind. Ken wins, but gives Ryu his iconic red headband. And then during the events of Alpha, Ryu meets Sakura, a schoolgirl who becomes infatuated with him and wants him to train her. He says, "Not right now." And then during the events of Alpha, a still recovering Sagat finds Ryu for the run back from Street Fighter 1. Sagat wins, and though he doesn't realize it at first, it's because Ryu lets him. And then during the events of Alpha, Ryu encounters fortune teller Rose, who tells him about the threat of M. Bison, an evil dictator who plans to use psycho power to take over the world and spread chaos and raise taxes. They fight. Bison wins, and seeing that Ryu has that super secret special potential hidden away within him, the evil dictator takes his KO'd body with the plan to inject his soul into it and use it as his very own. While brainwashing Ryu, Bison is interrupted by Ken, Sakura, and Sagat from earlier in the story, the former two of which fight Bison while the latter fights Ryu. His fight with Sagat reminds Ryu of his past and true self, saving him from Bison's mind bullets. Ryu then turns on M. Bison and destroys him with a Shoryuken, a technique so powerful it kills people until Capcom needs them to come back for Street Fighter II. This brings us to the events of Street Fighter II, which doesn't make a ton of sense with its story despite being the most iconic Street Fighter game ever. It was written relatively early, and it's likely most of the rest of the story just wasn't developed yet, so here's what happens. Bison gets himself a new body that looks a whole lot like his old body. Sagat is still one of Bison's right-hand men, despite having basically betrayed him back in Alpha. Bison puts on the second World Warrior tournament, Ryu enters, and we don't really know what all happens after that. He either leaves early or gets eliminated before the finals. It's actually really ambiguous and not satisfying at all. But well, on to Street Fighter IV. While the games don't tell us a ton, there's actually an entire animated film called The Ties That Bind that fleshes out many of the events surrounding Street Fighter IV. Ryu finds himself out in the desert, still very much struggling with his inner demons and not fully knowing whether to give in to the Satsui no Hado or not. He's being tracked by the Sin organization headed by new big baddie, Seth, who needs Ryu's inner power to fuel a doomsday device. Ryu winds up encountering secret agent Sea Viper, who is working under the guise of being a Sin agent but is actually kind of a neutral character. Cammy also shows up and fights Viper, who beats and tortures her. This sets Ryu off, leading him to be overcome by the Satsui no Hado and nearly kill Viper. Sakura and Ken show up, however, and the former is able to snap Ryu out of his evil trance with the power of a totally platonic hug. The good guys team up and wind up taking on the bad guys on a cruise ship where Ryu does battle with Seth. Having taken the upper hand, Seth starts monologuing about power, and this leads Ryu to a revelation about his own purpose, to protect good and to fight evil. Rejecting the Satsui no Hado and embracing its counterpart, Kyoshi no Hado, the power of nothingness, Ryu delivers a gnarly Metsu Hadouken to Seth. This defeats the villain, but doesn't kill him. Ryu collapses in exhaustion as a result of the effort, and both characters' respective buddies come and take them away to safety. Ryu doesn't play as much of a foreground role in Street Fighter IV, but this is where he encounters a viable alternative to a path of evil. Next up, the series actually moves in chronological order for the first and only time thus far as we jump into Street Fighter V. Ryu is still very much struggling with the Satsui no Hado, now trying to stifle it down as it continually creeps up and threatens to control him. He eventually visits Dalsim in India, who tells him that he must not try to stifle it, but rather conquer it. An ancient warrior named Necalli, who emerges every few hundred years to consume the souls of strong warriors, then appears and fights Ryu. A losing Ryu attempts to tap into the Satsui no Hado to turn the tide, but Dalsim stops him from embracing the darkness, and he himself fights with Necalli instead. After some time, Ryu and Necalli have a rematch, and during their battle, Ryu fully conquers the Satsui no Hado via the power of nothingness. He then easily defeats Necalli and goes on to join the rest of the Street Fighter good guys as they take on M. Bison in his latest evil plot to overthrow the world. Ryu nails Bison with a nothingness Hadouken, a technique so powerful it kills people until further notice. Though it doesn't appear in the events of the game's story, Ryu's evil side actually separates from him and becomes its own sentient being, Kage, which means shadow. This is the only canonical version of evil Ryu, who is otherwise more of a hypothetical character that Ryu could become if overcome by the Satsui no Hado. Time for Street Fighter III. Some 10 years after the events of Street Fighter I, yet another World Warrior tournament is put on by yet another new big baddie, Gil. Ryu comes across as more powerful than ever here before, but actually has very little to do with Street Fighter III's overall story, as it mainly focuses on Alex and the other newcomers to the franchise. As far as the tournament goes, we really only know that Ryu defeats Hugo. He spars with and defeats both Ken and Alex in friendly matches, but eventually loses in a bout with 150-year-old hermit Oro. Oro is arguably Street Fighter's most powerful single being, and decides to take Ryu under his wing and further train him. And that's the gist of the whole story leading up to Street Fighter VI, meaning we'll finally get to see what happens after the events of Street Fighter III. Ryu is clearly older than ever before, and having conquered his inner turmoil for a good while now, He is more likely to be a master-type figure, he wears Gouken's old robe now by the way, who could take on a protege at this point. If Capcom wants to further the Satsui no Hado struggle the character has almost always faced, they could have Kage reemerge to confront Ryu. We also have to wonder if it's finally time for Akuma and Ryu to clash again now that both characters have had their time to enter into what may be their final forms. This actually seems to be the most appropriate route we can see for developers to take things right now, as it's something that was set up all the way back in Alpha, where Akuma actually promised to murder Ryu if he didn't embrace the Satsui no Hado. Perhaps Ryu has a trainee under his belt, maybe Ken's son, Mel? And perhaps he must face both Akuma and Kage in a super awesome triple threat match of sorts. You know, Sagat has seen a long and winding story up until this point himself, and maybe he pops in when things are at their most dire to once again help Ryu out when he needs it the most. What do you expect will happen when Street Fighter VI drops in 2023? Please comment with your thoughts below, with a like and a sub so that you can know when our next video goes live. I've been John Velociraptor Guerrero for Event Hubs. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.